Imagine a world without vaccines, cancer treatments, genetic research, or in vitro fertilization. A world where studying the building blocks of life is impossible because scientists can't grow human cells outside the body. It might sound like science fiction, but this was the reality before 1951. Then everything changed when an African-American woman named Henrietta Lacks unknowingly donated the cells that made all of this possible. Hi, I'm here to tell you her story and show you why Henrietta Lacks is one of the most important people in science, even though almost no one knows her name. To understand how Henrietta Lacks' cells changed the world, we first need to go back to Henrietta herself. Born in 1920 in Roanoke, Virginia, Henrietta had a difficult childhood. When she was just 2 years old, her mother died of a heart condition. So Henrietta went to live with relatives in the small town of Clover, Virginia, where she worked long days on tobacco farms. She met her future husband, David Lacks, when she was 14 and they began dating. However, their romance wasn't easy. David was initially engaged to another woman, but he broke off that engagement and married Henrietta when she was only 16. Together, they had 5 children, 3 boys and 2 girls. In the early 1950s, the family moved from Virginia to Turner Station, Maryland, where they lived in a segregated community without indoor plumbing or proper waste disposal, which may have contributed to Henrietta's cancer. In 1951, she was diagnosed with cervical cancer and went to Johns Hopkins Hospital for treatment, which at the time was one of the only facilities in the area that had the necessary equipment for her surgery. Unfortunately, while under the care of some of the most respected doctors and scientists in the country, Henrietta became another statistic in a long line of tragic stories. Despite being a healthy, young woman in her early 30s with 5 children at home, she was not told about the risks of her procedure or offered alternatives. Doctors removed tissue samples from her tumor without telling her, her husband or her family, believing that since the procedure was painful enough, asking for consent would have just upset her. And in those days, there was no legal requirement to get informed consent for research. What happened next was pure chance. As it turned out, the cancer cells from Henrietta's tumor were unique. Unlike any cancer cells ever seen before, they could survive and reproduce indefinitely in the laboratory. That discovery completely changed the course of medical history and saved millions of lives. Scientists who received the cells named them HeLa after Henrietta Lacks. Today, HeLa cells are grown in almost every major university lab and research facility in the world. And more than 70 years later, billions of HeLa cells exist, having improved and saved countless lives. They played a role in developing the polio vaccine, advancing cancer research, studying genetic diseases, and gene mapping, helping to develop in vitro fertilization techniques, and assisting in understanding how viruses infect human cells. In fact, HeLa cells were the first human cells ever sent into space to study the effects of zero gravity and radiation. Without Henrietta Lacks, none of this would have been possible. But what makes this story so strange is that neither Henrietta nor her family knew that her cells were being used in research, let alone that they would become the foundation of modern medical science. In the early 1950s, race relations in the United States were tense, and most hospitals wouldn't treat black patients unless absolutely necessary. Even if they did, black patients were often treated worse than white patients. Black patients' privacy was often ignored, and they weren't always given the same quality of care. Additionally, there were very few laws protecting black women's reproductive rights, and informed consent was not standard practice. So when Henrietta Lacks went to Johns Hopkins Hospital for treatment, she was completely unaware of what would happen to her cells. But there's more to the story. The hospital didn't even keep detailed records, and the staff lost track of Henrietta's cells after just a few weeks. So for decades, the people working with HeLa cells had no idea where they came from. By the time the hospital realized that the cells had come from a patient, Henrietta had already passed away. Today, we know that Henrietta Lacks died in October 1951 at the age of 31 after a second surgery. She never learned that her cells were being used to change the world, but the legacy of her family and the importance of informed consent and respect for patients continue to be felt today. In 1975, 2 researchers working independently discovered the true origin of HeLa cells. One was a scientist at the National Cancer Institute, and the other was a researcher at the University of Michigan. At the time, scientists didn't share data like they do today, so neither researcher knew the other was onto the same discovery. Both realized that the cells had come from a black woman and set out to find her, but they couldn't find Henrietta Lacks because her cells had been labeled with a number instead of her name. The scientist at the National Cancer Institute found Henrietta's sister and showed her a photograph of the vials containing HeLa cells, but she didn't recognize them or understand their importance. She simply thought they were some kind of tonic. Only years later did the truth fully reveal itself. Today, the use of HeLa cells and the identity of their owner have become a major case study in medical ethics. Not only were Henrietta's cells taken without her permission, but they were used in experiments and sold to private companies without anyone telling her family or asking for their permission. Although Henrietta's family never received direct compensation for her cells, the director of the company that bought the cells admitted that the private company profited enormously from them and that the family deserved some kind of payment. Over the years, they've reached settlements with some institutions, but feel that's not enough. The Lacks family continues to push for greater recognition of the ethical issues surrounding Henrietta's cells. So if you enjoyed this video, please remember to leave us a like. And if you want to learn more about HeLa cells or other topics, please subscribe. Thanks for watching.
For me without asking. But my story still lives, and now the world knows my name. If this truth touched you, like, share, and subscribe, so others can learn what was once hidden. Let my legacy stand for dignity, for science, and for every voice that was never heard.